of national security and cybersecurity. Among his numerous responsibilities, Mr. Mayorkas led the department's response to the Zika and Ebola outbreaks, a relevant and timely experience that he will bring to DHS during this COVID-19 pandemic. Earlier in his career, Mr. Mayorkas served as Senate-confirmed U.S. Attorney in California. The national president of the Fraternal Order of Police enthusiastically endorsed Mr. Mayorkas, and I quote, "His professionalism, integrity, and commitment to just and fair enforcement of the law makes him an ideal candidate to lead the department. Mr. Mayorkas has pursued criminal wrongdoers and has protected the rights of the innocent with indefatigable vigor. His work reflects all that is right in government." Mr. Mayorkas is an outstanding nominee to be Secretary of Homeland Security. His experience, qualifications, deep expertise, and integrity will serve our nation well in this important and challenging position. Steady leadership at the Department of Homeland Security is sorely needed today. I urge my colleagues to expeditiously confirm Mr. Mayorkas so that he can serve as next Secretary of Homeland Security. Today, we'll get a chance to vote on Mr. Mayorkas. I sincerely hope that the Republican members of the Senate Judiciary Committee will allow us to set the stage for a hearing as quickly as possible for our next Attorney General, Merrick Garland. So much is at stake. The national security of the United States should be a higher priority than any partisan consideration. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
President.
The Senator from Louisiana.
Mr. President, I want to talk about two topics today. First, I want to address the issue of immigration. My good friend, Senator Durbin, is very articulate, and he is almost an expert on this issue, and I appreciate his comments. I want to just give you my perspective of immigration because it's so important. This is not why I came down here today, Mr. President. I love legal immigration. I think most Americans do. Louisianians love legal immigration. Welcome, and I say that with great confidence because every year the American people invite over 1 million of our world's neighbors to become American citizens in a legal manner. We are very welcoming in this country. We invite more people to become citizens in America than any other country in the world. And I'm flattered that people want to come here. I mean, other than someone living in North Korea, when's the last time you heard of somebody trying to sneak into China? People want to come to America, and I'm so proud of that fact. I don't believe in legal immigration. Some of my colleagues, not through the chair, Senator Durbin, but some of my colleagues think that vetting people at the border is racist. I don't. I think it's prudent. Every country does it. We respect the rule of law in this country, and illegal immigration is illegal. Duh. I mean, if you don't like the legal immigration or the immigration laws, one should change them. In the meantime, we have to follow the law. I'm not real crazy about traffic cameras. I think in many cases they're designed to just raise money, but I obey them. And when I get fined, I pay the fine. Doesn't happen often now, but I do it. Look, this country needs an immigration system that looks like somebody designed it on purpose. It does. I think the American people deserve that. And I would love to work with Senator Durbin. I'm not real interested in nibbling around the edges. I'm not real interested in piecemealing it. I'm not real interested in some sort of widespread amnesty. I think we ought to sit down. We all ought to take our meds and sit down as adults and senators in good faith, as all senators are, and try to tackle this problem in a global way. But I just wanted to make it clear, this is speaking for me personally. I learned a lot from listening to Senator Durbin, as I always do. I'm a steadfast believer in legal immigration, but I adamantly oppose illegal immigration. I think it's dangerous. I think it's unfair, especially to those people across the world who have waited in line patiently and followed the immigration laws of our country. Now, let me switch topics. One of the good things about politics and government, Mr. President, you've probably had this experience, is that you meet so many interesting people, and everybody's interesting in his own way. I've met people who are more famous than wise. I've met people who are more wise than famous. And I've met people who are both famous and wise. And one of the latter is what I'd like to talk about today. It's a gentleman by the name of Pat Shingleton. His name may not be famous here. It is back in Louisiana. But I can assure you that his virtues are. I want to honor the work of Pat Shingleton today. Pat is a Baton Rouge meteorologist, but he's also a longtime fixture in our community. He is retired. I think his last broadcast was Friday night. He has worked for 45 years, Mr. President. That's probably older than you, Mr. President. He's been reporting and trying to predict, and he has predicted with great accuracy, the weather in the Baton Rouge metropolitan community for 45 years. But Pat's experience covers a whole lot more than being a meteorologist, though he's one of the best I've ever seen in that regard. During his nearly half century of reporting the weather, Pat's not only covered more than 500 storms and hurricanes, but he's also hosted We Play Baton Rouge, a local game show, The Fifth Quarter, a sports show, Hotline After Dark, a local talk show where his guests, and I'm going to quote here, Mr. President, run the gamut from champion bodybuilders to beer brewers to duck callers. We're a very diverse people in Louisiana. Pat has a warm heart, and he cares for the state and the Baton Rouge community, and that's been on display for a lot of years, Mr. President. I'm not telling my people back home anything they don't already know. Pat's especially well known for being chairman of WBRZ Channel 2 in Baton Rouge, a prominent local station where Pat has worked for so long. Pat has worked hard as chairman of that station's Pat's Coats for Kids. Pat's Coats for Kids. And this program has, unfortunately, we have children in America and in Louisiana who are hungry and cold. You can't learn when you're hungry. You can't learn when you're cold. Pat's delivered hundreds of thousands, could be in the millions for all I know, of coats to kids whose parents can't afford to keep them warm in the winter. He's also created the, quote, Fill a Prescription for the Needy project, and he started Baton Rouge St. Patrick's Day Parade, the Wearing of the Green, it's called, which he continues to coordinate every single year. Pat's final broadcast took place Friday night, as I mentioned, January 29. That does not, I can assure you, knowing Pat Singleton, that does not mark the end of his service to the people of Baton Rouge. I can say that with great confidence. I predict that Pat will continue to contribute as a community advocate, as a spokesperson at WBRZ. I predict he'll continue to champion all the charity projects that he's spearheaded for so many years. Now, when asked about his retirement, Pat said, and I'm going to quote, "I think we're all given a whole bunch of heartbeats. We're all given a whole bunch of heartbeats, Pat said. And God gives us these heartbeats to do something good. What an elegant way of putting it. Pat's used his heartbeats pretty well, in my judgment. He's got a lot more to go, but he's done it for the good of our state, for the good of the Baton Rouge metropolitan community, and he's done it in the newsroom, and he's done it outside the newsroom. Pat says he's going to spend extra time with his family. Good for him. He's earned it, especially his 1-year-old grandchild. Look, we're going to miss his guiding hand through Louisiana's irreverent weather patterns. We may have to draft him back on a few occasions, but I want to wish him a joyful retirement to soak in all the perks of being a grandfather. Pat, thank you. Thank you for your hard work for the people of Baton Rouge. Thank you for your giving so much to the people of Louisiana for all of these 45 years. You're a good person, and you're a fine American. God bless you and your family. Thank you, Mr. President. I suggest, sir, the absence of a quorum. I withdraw that. I withdraw that suggestion. I think I'd rather just yield, Mr. President.
President. Senator from Michigan. Mr. President, I rise today in support of Pete Buttigieg and his nomination to lead the Department of Transportation. Whether it's rebuilding our crumbling roads and bridges, maintaining our leadership in the global mobility race, or improving pipeline safety, there's no shortage of challenges facing our incoming secretary. As a fellow Midwesterner and as a former officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve, I can't think of anyone more equipped to take on this challenge than Pete Buttigieg. He understands the need to revitalize our infrastructure because he's seen it in our neighborhoods and on our roads each and every day when he served as a mayor. He has a unique understanding of how the department can be a resource to state and to local governments, and what can be done to ensure that the federal government supports those states and local governments and make sure that need gets addressed most effectively. If we're going to build back better, a partnership at each level of government will be absolutely vital. Having someone at the helm who recognizes that that relationship is so important will be an incredible asset to the department. I've also had several conversations with Secretary-designate Buttigieg on the auto industry, which is the very beating heart of our manufacturing economy. And as the industry advances both towards electrification and self-driving technologies, it will be critical that we support these technologies to make sure that they are safely deployed and that they are deployed here in the United States. We have an opportunity to save lives, but also to create jobs and empower our domestic auto industry to take the moonshot for artificial intelligence and spur technological innovation. And I'm pleased that Secretary-designate Buttigieg has committed to working with us as we craft legislation that establishes a federal framework around these new technologies. And finally, I'm excited to work with Secretary-designate Buttigieg on improving pipeline safety, especially around the Great Lakes. We know that Line 5 under the Straits of Mackinac pose a very serious threat to the Great Lakes. And the Great Lakes are not only an economic driver and natural resource for our country, they're literally in the DNA of every Michigander. As a Midwesterner and as a husband to a Michigan native who was born and raised in Traverse City, Secretary-designate Buttigieg fully recognizes the need to protect the Great Lakes. I agree with Mayor Pete's belief that he says, quote, good transportation policy can play no less a role than making possible the American dream. I am proud to support Pete Buttigieg's historic nomination, which has already garnered bipartisan support, and I urge all of my colleagues to vote for him. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Michigan.
President, I have 6 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted. The Senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ahead of our votes today, I want to echo the concerns that have already been voiced by many of my colleagues in this chamber regarding the nomination of Alejandro Mayorkas to be the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. At this point, we're all very familiar with his long legacy of service on behalf of the people of the United States. So I'll just highlight one example of value that he'll bring to the table should the Senate vote to confirm him. When he served as USCIS director during the Obama administration, the Inspector General was forced to investigate, quote, an extraordinary, end quote, number of internal allegations that Mayorkas was granting special access and special favors to wealthy EB-5 investor visa applicants linked to influential Democrats. When the IG took a closer look at the visa applications for 3 powerful Chinese nationals in particular, they came to the conclusion that if Mayorkas hadn't intervened, and I'm quoting, the matter would have been decided differently, end quote. Now, Mr. President, this is something that we know is inappropriate. We know that this is something for which Mr. Mayorkas should be held accountable. We know that this is something for which he has not been held accountable. And here is what he did. He put his thumb on the scale, pressured his DHS colleagues, to break their own rules and turned the law on its head, all because a few powerful friends asked him to do it. He pressured others for the benefit of some powerful friends. And it is all there for everyone to read in the Inspector General's report, and yet he was never held accountable. And yet, here we are being asked to support his nomination to the president's cabinet. There are plenty of policy differences between myself and Mr. Mayorkas that have convinced me I have no choice but to stand in opposition to his confirmation. But the example I just cited in particular gives me additional serious concerns about how his influence would affect the integrity of the agency. Just last week, I joined several of my colleagues in a letter to the senior senator from Illinois asking him to exercise his judgment as the incoming chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee and allow for a second hearing so we could examine Mr. Mayorkas' record thoroughly. Because while I believe that the president has every right to assemble his cabinet, I also believe that the American people have every right to understand exactly who is being put in charge of enforcing our nation's immigration laws and keeping our borders secure, enforcing counterterrorism measures, and keeping an eye on the country's cybersecurity. And the current nominee never held accountable for showing favor to some friends in high places. That's not the way this is supposed to be. And I would urge my colleagues to consider what the American people the taxpayers who are footing the bill for every salary that is given to every individual working with the federal government. What is the standard? What do they expect from their leaders? Thereby, I oppose the nomination, and I yield my time and notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I ask the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I come to the floor today to support the nomination of Pete Buttigieg to be Secretary of Transportation. We all know the nominee as Mayor Pete, a man who basically came onto the national stage as a Midwest mayor who had lots of enthusiasm for making investments in America's future. So today we're considering his nomination to be Secretary of Transportation at a time when we need a lot of work done on transportation. And in my opinion, he's a young, energetic mayor who is going to help us usher in a new era of transportation. That means there's going to be a lot of bipartisan dialogue about how we get there. But this job should not be underestimated in the importance that the transportation sector and the investments for the future need. That is that our transportation system serves as a backbone of our economy. And when it's not doing well, the consequential impacts of that affect our economy. It affects how our businesses compete in a global economy. It affects how people get to and from work, and it affects their home life as well. So it's a big job that we have. And I know that this mayor and future Secretary of Transportation understands how big this challenge is. We've underinvested in our infrastructure for decades. In the past 10 years alone, we've underfunded our infrastructure needs by $1.5 trillion. The American Society of Engineers estimates that we need to invest $5.6 trillion in our infrastructure over the next 2 decades, or the United States stand to lose about $10.3 trillion in GDP. I know this because my state knows this. I think the presiding officer knows this as well. If the transportation infrastructure doesn't work, goods and services don't get through your ports, they don't get to their destination, and businesses choose other vehicles or other avenues for the products to be delivered. America needs to be competitive. And the American public also knows that poor infrastructure and the problems that they see in their communities have to be addressed, whether that's concrete crumbling off of bridges, delayed trains, buses, congestions, railroads, or any of the many issues. Just this week, a highway in California slid into the ocean, disrupting traffic along the famous Highway 1, And this could be a delay for months. I know, again, the presiding officer understands this as well as the state of Washington. Mother Nature doesn't always comply with our transportation needs. So while these investments in numbers may seem huge to people, it is what this investment will enable that we need to keep focused on. We need to focus on the fact that the United States makes and grows things, and we need to get them to their destinations. We need people to be able to get to their place of employment. So we need someone at the Department of Transportation who is enthusiastic about taking on these challenges and helping President Biden administer a new era of transportation and the challenges that we face. Mayor Buttigieg, a Harvard graduate, Rhodes Scholar, former United States reservist, who I believe served in Afghanistan, also understands the challenges of small town mayors and the things that transportation systems and the impacts they can have. He knows the challenges we now face because of COVID-19, that there is a new burden on our transportation system because of the impacts of lost revenue. State departments of transportation estimate $50 billion in lost revenues over the next 5 years. Airports have lost $23 billion because of people no longer flying. Transit agencies have lost an estimated $50 billion by the end of 2021. So these losses will continue to compound until we find the best way to protect our transportation workers, our travelers, and to continue to help with personal protective equipment, testing, vaccines, clear health-based protocols to help return safety to our transportation system and public confidence. That is one of the reasons why we're fighting so hard for this next package of investments. President Biden took decisive action by mandating that people wear masks, which is a giant step forward in our transportation system. I think there's more we can do, and hopefully our colleagues can work together on that. The long-term revenue outlook for transportation also is changing, and so it will be a long time before its recovery. So I believe that Mayor Pete Buttigieg is the right choice for this job because he was mayor of South Bend. He dealt with infrastructure where the rubber meets the road, managing state, federal, and local resources to help build infrastructure in his community. He also helped facilitate public-private partnerships for the dollars to go farther and important models for future investments in transportation. One of those projects, the South Shore Double Track Project, whose full funding grant agreement was signed earlier this month, is like many other state and local projects. The South Shore Double Track demanded impressive coordination between the federal, state, and local governments to bring it to fruition. Mayor Buttigieg's Smart Street Initiative also shows he knows how to operate and succeed in a current environment and will be able to help communities around the country replicate the success that he had at South Bend. He won't be the first mayor to be the Secretary of Transportation, but I think we can say that when you have a mayor in that job, they're going to pay attention to local transportation infrastructure investment to help our communities continue to grow and be competitive. We have a major opportunity, I believe, to now deliver on infrastructure needs of many of those communities. We should start immediately by talking about infrastructure packages and working on the transportation infrastructure plan for the 21st century, because it's clear we have opportunities this year with the surface transportation programs expiring in September. Communities everywhere are demanding that we help work on these important issues for their communities. But Mayor Buttigieg will also be called on thinking about the new eras of transportation and how we maintain our competitiveness. He will have to think about issues of ensuring safety with new autonomous vehicle technologies and unmanned aircraft. He'll have to promote stronger emission standards for automobiles, aviation, and maritime industries. He'll have to support the continued growth of electric vehicle infrastructure. He'll have to make big investments in game-changing projects that will help us move freight more cost-effectively through our nation. People will want to know and understand what our reliable passenger rail and transit systems and the investment in bridges are going to be for the future. So all of this are a big challenge, but I know that this nominee is up to that challenge. He did well at the committee in making sure that people understood that he believes that those challenges need to be addressed for America to continue to move forward. From my perspective, just in the state of Washington, before COVID had really hit, we saw 78 hours per year of delayed traffic. That is, the average commuter spent 78 hours in delayed traffic. A recent study in my state estimated that Washingtonians lost more than $7.4 billion each year in lost time and wasted fuel due to congestion, deteriorated roads, and safety problems. As America starts to head back to the office, no one wants to spend time back in that world of congestion. And so we need to make critical investments. People in Puget Sound know that we need to fix the West Seattle Bridge. They know in Southwest Washington that the Columbia River needs a new bridge across I-5. In Eastern Washington, they know that we need a north-south corridor. And in Everett, they know that the trestle needs replacement if goods from Eastern Washington are going to get to the Port of Everett and out the door. All of these things are investments, and with them come the structures of things like at-grade crossings, passenger rail systems, and safety that are huge, I believe, infrastructure investments that have not been quite appreciated. I was very pleased to get Mr. Buttigieg's commitment during our session with him that these things, at-grade crossings, ports competitiveness, and moving products safely should be a big priority for the future. The Lander Street project in Seattle, which was an investment of the new freight program, was just a few blocks, but literally congestion for hours had stopped traffic from getting from I-5 to the Port of Seattle. The Lander Street in a lot of ways represents what it really is, a bridge to the future, a bridge to get people moving where they need to go and the right investment being competitive for the future. Well, we're going to face many more delays if America doesn't remain competitive. So I look forward to working with Mr. Buttigieg on all of these issues. He also, during the committee hearing process, committed that he will continue to work with Senator Wicker and I on the important issues of aviation safety. He committed to us that he understood that aviation safety and the FAA need to continue to make reforms. I believe that if you want to be the leaders in aviation, you have to be the leaders in aviation safety. And I think Mayor Buttigieg gets and understands that that will be a very big job of the Department of Transportation as well. So, Mr. President, I enthusiastically support this nominee. I look forward to the type of focus that he can give to the Department of Transportation. This area of our government right now needs to address the COVID crisis. It needs to help us plan for a better transportation system of the future. And it needs to understand that this transportation infrastructure and investment in these changes in these sectors of cars and planes and passenger systems are all very dynamic, changing industries. And so our competitiveness will be at stake as well. So I encourage my colleagues to support this nominee. I'm sure we will hear a lot of discussion from him and a lot of bipartisan effort to help get our transportation system fully funded. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. And you want me to, Mr. President, I would ask you to officiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. President,
Senator from Rhode Island.
could we have the yeas and nays?
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The yeas and nays are ordered.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Under the previous order, the question is on the nomination. The yeas and nays were previously ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn,
It's nonpartisan.
Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee. No. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt, Booker, Burr, Cantwell, Cardin, Cornyn, Ernst, Feinstein, Hirono, Johnson, Kelly, Lujan, Menendez, Moran, Murphy, Murray, Padilla, Reed, Rosen, Schatz, Sinema, Smith, Whitehouse, Wicker, and Young. Mr. Brown, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Cotton, Cruz. Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rounds, aye. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Wyden, Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Cassidy, no. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Marshall, no. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Ms. Warren, Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Deans, aye. Ms. Lummis, Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. Tuberville, no. Mr. Sass, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mrs. Hyde Smith, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Paul, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Braun, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye.